Okay, so let's talk a little bit about contrast here. And I think this image is good for demonstrating that particular thing because it's fairly bright. And the reason for that is contrast plays an important role in the degree to which we can color grade an image. Because if we have a very bright image like this, where there's not a lot of shadows, I mean, we can see everything is really concentrated on the histogram towards the bright side of things. You know, we have very little in the shadow end here. So generally speaking, there's not that much that we can do in terms of drastic changes in color. So if we go, let's say, into the highlights section over here, and we start playing with this, let's say we want to warm up the highlights a little bit. You can see that if everything is super bright, I mean, all we can really do is color cast the image because everything is so bright, everything is almost a highlight, and so we just create this sort of warmer color cast. Let's say we go into shadows. There's not a whole lot of them. I mean, really our shadow is like maybe this area behind her neck here, and you know, some areas over here in the shadows near her hand and foot. So if we go into shadows and let's say we grab this cooler shadow here and we crank that up, this is what we've got. We've got, you know, this slight blue cast within the shadows. But generally speaking, obviously we're not affecting the rest of the image too much because the rest of the image is not a shadow at all. It's very, very bright. So if we go into our exposure here and we turn this down, you can see by taking that exposure down to, let's say, -1/3, we can really now see that blue that we've added. And if we go into the highlights section and we go back to here and we try and warm things up, we can see we've got that nice difference, right? We've got the cooler shadows and the warmer highlights, and we can obviously play with those colors, but you can see that that's a really noticeable color grade. But as we kind of turn this up here and we go to more of a high key look, that look fades away and we're kind of left back with that color casted kind of look where everything really just looks yellowish, and that blue that we added into the shadows really doesn't do much of anything. So that's another important thing, is kind of your starting exposure and the degree of contrast. So now if we exposure is one thing, so that's basically, exposure is how bright is the overall image. Contrast, on the other hand, is kind of the difference between the shadows and the highlights. Is the easiest way to think about it, you know, is how intense is that. And you can see that on here, that our highlights are not fully white. They're, you know, we've got a fair bit of room on this side of the histogram. What we can do inside of Capture One is to really clip that, and you can do that inside of Lightroom too by cranking up highlights. You know, we can clip that out to the point where we see this histogram up here shift towards the end, and you know, the really bright stuff goes really bright. So we're increasing the contrast that way. If we take this end here and we want the shadows to become deeper, then you can see the shadows really going dark, and again, we're increasing the contrast now. So the contrast will also greatly change the way your image looks. Generally speaking, at the raw level, I don't want to over contrast my images because I want a little bit of flexibility. So, you know, in this case, I've completely clipped these blacks over here and there's just no detail there. I don't really want to bring that in. I want a fairly robust raw file that I can really work with, to have the information there. By losing that, I'm really not accomplishing what I want. Now, this can be a good exercise for, again, seeing what kind of look you want in the end. Perhaps this is kind of closer to your final look. But at the raw stage, I recommend, you know, let's keep it somewhere around here so we have, you know, a good degree of contrast, but not so much that we can't work with it. And similarly here, even though we're not fully, you know, clipped on the highlight end, I don't really want to bring this to this point because then we see that some of the detail on the leg here starts to go and it becomes very bright. So we can certainly, you know, increase the brightness of the background later if we want to inside of Photoshop. So to me, I'm quite happy with this level of contrast where we have good detail through everything, and we have a nice sort of pliable raw file. So we're, you know, down 1/4 of a stop compared to something like this maybe. Even if you want this high key look at the end, it's probably better to start with something that's going to give you more flexibility at this end. And you can just kind of see that with, you know, the degree to which our color grading shows at a slightly lower exposure than it would at the very high key look. And so let's just go ahead and revert back all this stuff that we did here. Let's get our image back to a fairly neutral level. And then in terms of white balance, again, you know, kind of sampling off the background here, this does feel pretty neutral to me throughout. Just looking at the numbers, we can see the background, generally speaking, is fairly uniform from this side to this side, and the floor, which is gray, is also fairly uniform. So we have a nice neutral file, and in this kind of look, I think a neutral file is a great starting point. That is kind of, you know, the consideration you want to make with contrast is that you want a good balance of it. If you want something that is very high key versus very low key, that's a consideration that you need to make at the raw stage. And if, partially that, obviously that decision has been made for you by the photographer, because generally speaking, if we want a high key look, we won't shoot it underexposed by 2 stops and ask you to make it high key. But, that's definitely something that you also have to consider, because whether an image is a more low-key image or a high-key image, it definitely affects the sort of color grading that you can apply to it. Generally, high-key images, the color grade you're going to be able to make is very subtle. You're not going to be able to make a huge change to the image. With a low-key image, you can kind of go crazy because it's very easy to inject shadows with different color casts. But if everything is very bright, very white, it's harder to make a sort of a color grade that is going to be really unique and interesting. Generally speaking, everything is bright. Everything is going to take on one certain color cast. So that's just something you need to know off the raw file or at the raw stage. Ultimately, we're going to be working on the color grading once we get it into Photoshop. So that's really all I'm going to talk about at the raw level. So for the most part, your focus is, or how do we want this particular histogram to be distributed? Try and keep a good distribution, of course. That's just basics of retouching. Make sure that you have a good dynamic range to work off of. Make your exposure kind of close to what you want the final exposure to be. Again, if this is sort of the look that I'm after, I'm not going to start with an image like this. Because that's just I'm not going to be able to bring that out inside of Photoshop. If I want it to be brighter and kind of airier, let's start with a proper exposure. So that part needs to be determined up front. And then finally, of course, white balance has to be correct. Again, we don't want to start with this image at this point when the neutral was around here, because we do want a more of a natural look for this particular image, let's say. So I hope you found that helpful. Essentially, the raw file, it's important. We can do a lot inside of Photoshop, but it's always important to have a plan before you get into Photoshop. So experiment a little bit, play with the white balances, play with some of the tools that either Lightroom or Capture One have to give you a roadmap for the rest of your retouching, and that way you won't find yourself inside of Photoshop wishing that you'd done something at the raw stage when it's now too late to do it. So for the next lesson, we're actually going to jump into Photoshop, and we're going to start taking some of these images, and we're going to use the tools within Photoshop to color grade them. We'll see you in the next lesson.